Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my July wrap-up. Today I'm going to be telling you about everything I read for Jane Austen July. So July, every year for me, is Jane Austen July. If you don't know what Jane Austen July is, I will link more information down below about this readathon, but it's a readathon I've been hosting for years, along with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish and Claudia from Spencer's Library, where we celebrate Jane Austen and Jane Austen related things. So I read 10 things in July, although 3 of those things were very much not full-length things at all, so didn't get through as much as I wanted to in July, but that is okay. So let me go through what I read for Jane Austen July. So the first challenge every Jane Austen July is to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels, and I read 2. So I reread Sense and Sensibility, which was our group read for this year, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Sense and Sensibility is the story of 2 very different sisters, Eleanor and Marianne. Eleanor has a lot of sense, she really keeps her emotions in check, whereas Marianne is very emotional and wears her heart on her sleeve. And we look at the differences between these 2 sisters, and especially how they deal with the changes to their life when they, their mother and their younger sister have to leave their childhood home after the death of their father and move into a small cottage in a place they have never been to before. And we follow their romantic relationships and their relationship with each other. And it's such an interesting novel that is in many ways about siblings and family above all. As I have said a few times over Jane Austen July, Sense and Sensibility is a book I have really gone on a journey with. It was my least favourite Jane Austen book for a long time, but now it really ranks up there for me. I really love it. I think it is fantastic, such an interesting sibling story with such interesting themes, and yeah, just a book I love a lot. I made a couple of individual videos talking in depth about some things in Sense and Sensibility, so I'll leave down below my video about siblings in Sense and Sensibility and also about Mrs Jennings, a wonderful character who I love a lot. The other Jane Austen novel I read in July was Emma. I didn't actually read this edition physically. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Juliet Stevenson, which I really enjoyed. It was the first time I'd ever listened to Emma rather than reading it, though I have read it many times before, and that was a lovely experience. Emma is a wonderful novel which follows the character of Emma Woodhouse, who is clever, handsome and rich, and she doesn't want to get married. She's decided she doesn't want to get married, but she does like to matchmake her neighbours and friends, and at the beginning of the book her governess has recently married a man who lives nearby, so she takes under her wing a girl called Harriet Smith, who is kind of from the local boarding school, and she decides to find someone for Harriet Smith to marry, and everything kind of goes on from there. It's a really great love story and a really great kind of character story. I really enjoy so much about Emma. I love the setting of Highbury, this sort of large village, small town, filled with these interesting people. I love so many of the side characters, like Miss Bates is just a joy to read her several, pages and minutes of dialogue. I really enjoy Jane Fairfax and her story. I think she's really interesting. I love all the kind of subplots and threads in Emma, and Emma herself is a really interesting character. She is sometimes frustrating to read about because she is like a massive snob and really interfering and frustrating and sometimes quite unkind, but I also find her truly believable as a character, and I really enjoy reading about her. So I loved rereading Emma, such a great book, and it had been quite a while since I'd read that one, so that was lovely too. And then for the second challenge of Jane Austen July, to read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels, I read her 2 unfinished novels, which were our group reads for Jane Austen July. So I read Sandton and the Watsons in this bind-up here. So Sandton is the novel that Jane Austen was writing when she died. She hadn't written very much of it. We have sort of 12 chapters, and I feel like you just don't get a good sense of what Sandton was going to be as a book. You have an interesting setting of this kind of like seaside town that's kind of up and coming, but possibly not as up and coming as it thinks it is. But I don't really think you get a great sense of the characters in Sandton. Charlotte, who I guess is kind of the main character, I feel like I just don't really know anything about her, and I get a good sense of some of the minor characters, especially the sort of like invalid sisters of the man that Charlotte's staying with, who I think are quite interesting, but I find it hard to get much out of Sandton because I just feel like it is so much a beginning, and it's not a beginning that tells you that much. In general, I just don't find Sandton nearly as rewarding a read as I do The Watsons, which is Jane Austen's other unfinished novel, which she was working on in, we think, kind of like 1802, 1803, but then she put aside. The Watsons is the story of a young woman called Emma Watson, who has been raised by an aunt, a wealthy aunt who she was kind of expecting to inherit everything from, but her aunt has remarried unexpectedly and Emma is no longer wanted. So she gets sent back to live with her father and her siblings who she doesn't really know very well. And the book kind of opens with Emma and her sister Elizabeth kind of discussing an upcoming ball. And we see the relationship between Emma and Elizabeth. We get this ball and the introduction of a lot of different characters. And I just love the Watsons so much. And I'm so sad that Jane Austen didn't finish it. And I feel like I'm more sad that she didn't finish the Watsons than I am that she didn't finish Sandton, because I feel like you get a much stronger sense in the Watsons of the book it was going to be and of all the characters. We don't actually have more like text of the Watsons than Sandton, I don't think, but I feel like you get a much stronger sense of the characters and the story from the Watsons than you do from Sandton. We think that the reason Jane Austen abandoned this novel was because her kind of plan of the book was that Emma's father was going to pass away, and then her own father passed away, and it was just a bit too close to home. That's what we think anyway. But I really wish that she had finished the Watsons, because I think it would have been amazing, and I find the characterization really interesting. It's interesting to think about how the things that she was going to incorporate in the Watsons might have ended up in other novels. The fact that Emma has been raised by this aunt in a kind of wealthier life and then has been sent back home to her family kind of reminds me of a little bit of Mansfield Park. And also Emma Watson's kind of father's health is quite uncertain, and that kind of reminded me maybe of Mr Woodhouse in Emma, and the kind of like social position of Emma Watson and her family feels a bit more like kind of Miss Bates, Jane Fairfax in Emma. So I do wonder if maybe elements of what she had been planning to incorporate into the Watsons ended up in other things, but I do wish she had written it because I do think it would have been great. Anyway, that's enough of a ramble about the Watsons. Let me tell you about the other things that I read for Jane Austen July. The third challenge for Jane Austen July is to read a non-fiction work about Jane Austen or her time. And this year I went very much for books about Jane Austen's time. So I read The Anarchy by William Dalrymple, which is a history of the East India Company. So this spans from like when the East India Company was founded in the 17th century up until the early 19th century, but the majority of it is about the 18th century. This is a book I've been meaning to read for ages, and I listened to it on audiobook and found it really interesting. I think there was a lot in this book that was fascinating. I think especially the kind of contextualization of the East India Company within both imperialism and colonialism and capitalism was really interesting, like looking at the East India Company as a company, like a corporate entity managed to conquer a very big country, and the way William Dalrymple picks apart that is really interesting. I will say that this is a very like narrative political history book, full of like this event happened, then this event happened, then this event happened, which is interesting, but I kind of feel like I could have done with a little bit more analysis, and there's definitely not like my favourite style of history book. I prefer a kind of more like analytical social history, and I kind of knew like that a history of the East India Company was not going to be a social history, but I feel like I would have liked a bit more of the social history alongside the kind of political and military history. I also wouldn't necessarily recommend listening to this on audiobook because William Dalrymple uses a lot of quotes and extracts from primary sources, which I really like, but when you're listening to something, it's quite hard to tell when a quote has ended. So that made it slightly harder, I guess, to read. But I did, in general, find it really interesting, and I'm glad that I finally read it. And then the other non-fiction book that I started but didn't finish in Jane Austen July was this. This is Gentlemen of Uncertain Fortune by Rory Moore, how younger sons made their way in Jane Austen's England. And this is a really interesting book, basically about younger sons of the upper and upper middle classes. People in the Georgian period in the 18th and early 19th century who came from families with money and class, but weren't themselves financially independent, because the tradition was at this point in time that the eldest son would always kind of inherit all the money. And therefore this book looks at kind of what jobs and professions were open to the younger sons of this class. So basically the book has like a few introductory chapters and then goes through like professions. So we have a chapter on the church, on medicine, on barristers, on attorneys and solicitors, on banking and commerce, on civil office, on the navy, the army, on working in India, which will be really interesting to read, having just read The Anarchy. So this has been a really interesting kind of social, economic, cultural history that I have found fascinating. This is very much my kind of history book, and I'm really, really enjoying it so far. I'm about halfway through and I should finish it off in August. As I said, I'm really enjoying it. It's very readable and very, very interesting, but I just didn't quite manage to finish it off in Jane Austen July because, you know, life was busy. The next challenge for Jane Austen July is to read a retelling of a Jane Austen book or a work of historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time. And this challenge is the challenge I read the most for. I read 4 things for this challenge, and I think partly my Jane Austen July has felt a bit unbalanced to me because I read more in the first half of the month than in the second half of the month, and I read quite a few of these in the first half of the month and kind of imagined that I would balance them out with books for other challenges in the second half of the month, and then didn't quite manage to do that, but that's okay. So the first thing that I read for this challenge was Mrs Wickham by Sarah Page. So this is an audiobook or maybe a radio drama. Is it really an audiobook? I'm not sure. It is kind of a short story or novella about the character who becomes Mrs Wickham in Pride and Prejudice. Trying to avoid spoilers there, but I really enjoyed Mrs Wickham as a story. I thought it was a really good kind of character study, coming of age story. Not everything in it fitted exactly with Pride and Prejudice, and there were definitely a few like historical inaccuracies or like language that just kind of pulled me out for a second, but that is like a picky point from the copy editor in me, not from the reader in me. And in general, I really enjoyed it and thought it was a really good read, and it had a good like arc and ending to it. So I'd really recommend that. It's only like 2-3 hours on audiobook on Audible, and I really enjoyed reading it. And then the other Jane Austen retelling I read was The Late Mrs Willoughby by Claudia Gray. This is the second book in a series where we encounter lots of different characters from lots of different Jane Austen books solving murders. So the first book in the series, The Murder of Mr Wickham, pulls together a lot of different people from a lot of different Jane Austen novels, all coming together for a house party where Mr Wickham turns up and is then killed. And Juliet Tilney, the daughter of some people from Northanger Abbey, and Jonathan Darcy, the son of some people from Pride and Prejudice, team up to solve crimes. They're both in their kind of like late teens, early 20s. And then in the second book in the series, The Late Mrs Willoughby, they again have to team up to solve a murder when Mr Willoughby's wife is killed. Obviously, it's called The Late Mrs Willoughby. I really enjoyed this book. It's a really fun murder mystery with a lot of like Jane Austen joy in it. I really enjoyed how all the sort of minor characters from Sensibility were interpreted in this book. And I also really enjoyed Juliet Tilney and Jonathan Darcy. I just really like them both as characters, and I think they're drawn really well. And their kind of like growing friendship and relationship is just done really well, but also like quite slowly and believably slowly over the 2 books that I've read so far. And I'm quite excited to read the third book in the series. I will say that you absolutely should not read The Late Mrs Willoughby until you have read The Murder of Mr Wickham, because it spoils the mystery of the murder of Mr Wickham completely. Like, I know that some murder mystery series with recurring detective figures don't spoil the previous books in the series, but The Late Mrs Willoughby absolutely does spoil and refer to the mystery of the murder of Mr Wickham, so I would really recommend reading the series in order. But I really enjoyed this, and yeah, I'm excited to read the next book in the series. So those are the 2 retellings I read, both of which obviously historical retellings, and then I read 2 works of historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time. One of these was A Lady's Guide to Scandal by Sophie Irwin, which was the book we read for my Patreon historical fiction book club, and I really, really loved this. And I think everyone in the book club really enjoyed it too, which was lovely. I just thought this was such a like pure delight of a book. I just had such a good time reading A Lady's Guide to Scandal, and I just read it like during quite a stressful week, and it was just the joy that I needed. This is a really lovely, clever, funny, wonderful novel set in the Regency period about a woman called Eliza, and Eliza's husband has very recently passed away. They didn't have a good marriage. It was very much a marriage of convenience, and now she is 27 years old. She is a widow, and she has a chance to kind of re-establish herself in life, and her and her cousin, who's kind of her best friend, move together to Bath. And meanwhile, she also meets again the man she gave up 10 years ago in order to marry the Earl. So there is a bit of a like persuasion riff to the book, but there's also a bit of a love triangle and a lot of other things going on. Eliza also loves to paint and is trying to like maybe forge a career for herself as an artist, and I just loved so much about this book because it is both a really like delightful, fun love story, but also there is so much going on here. The character development was just so well done. The theme of the kind of position of women at this point in time, the position of people of colour at this point in time. There are 2 characters Eliza encounters, the Melvilles, a brother and sister. Their father was an English earl who married an Indian woman. Their parents are now dead, and the Melvilles are upper class. You know, Lord Melville is an earl, so he has to be like respected to a certain level in society, but the constant like double standards and judgment that they receive from the society they move in. I just thought that was drawn really cleverly and subtly and done really well, and I loved them as characters so much. Lord Melville, like, utterly has my heart. Side note, but I haven't done the mid-year freakout tag for a while, but every time I have done the mid-year freakout tag, there's always that question that's like, who's your newest literary crush? And I'm like, oh, I never have literary crushes, but Lord Melville. Lord Melville. I just thought A Lady's Guide to Scandal was both so like fun and so subtly thought-provoking, and I just had a whale of a time with it. So I highly, highly recommend it. I thought it was amazing. I also recommend Sophie Owen's first novel, A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting, but I think I loved A Lady's Guide to Scandal even more, and I just had a great time. So that was great. Then another wonderful book I read was Drama and Danger by J.T. Williams. This is the first book in the Lizzie and Belle mystery series, which is a series of middle grade mysteries set in Georgian London. So Lizzie and Belle are two 12-year-old girls who are based on real historical figures. So Belle is Dido Belle and Lizzie is Lizzie Sancho, the daughter of Charles Ignatius Sancho, who's a really interesting historical figure. He was the first black person to vote in Britain. And I read a work of historical fiction about him last year, which is The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho by Patterson Joseph. And I really loved that book. And so it was really nice reading Drama and Danger whenever Ignatius Sancho appeared. I was obviously thinking about him as the character within Drama and Danger, but I was also like linking him to the character in Patterson Joseph's book. And in my head, these two books like very happily existed side by side. So that was like an added extra fun element. You know, I'd read about Ignatius Sancho in another novel before. And I really enjoyed Drama and Danger. I thought it was a good fun. It's not a murder mystery, it's an attempted murder mystery. Someone is attempting to kill Lizzie's father, and Lizzie and Belle are trying to team up to solve it. And it's a really fun, easy read that I think a lot of kids would really enjoy, but I also feel like it would be really educational. It has a lot about Black British history in it. It has a lot about the position of women in the Georgian period. There's a lot about like the history of the theatre. Like, I just feel like there's a lot that would be really, really interesting for kids, but also as an adult, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading more books in the series too. Then the final reading challenge for Jane Austen July is to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. So, you know, a book published between 1775 and 1817, and I wanted to read more than I did for this. I only managed to read one book, but you know, that's fine. But I read this. This is The Travels of Dean Mahomet, an 18th century journey through India. So this book was published in Ireland in 1794, and it's the first book published by an Indian person in English. Dean Mahomet had grown up in India, ended up as an officer in the East India Company Army, then moved to Ireland and later to England. And this book was published in the 1790s. And it's really interesting because it's a book that is about India, but it was very much written like with a Western European audience in mind. And it's really interesting to think both about what Dean Mahomet says, but also who he was saying it to, and you know, the way he chooses to present things, and why he might have done that. Like, it's really interesting. The book is kind of written like in the style of 18th century Western travel writing, and it's also epistolary. Like, every chapter begins, "Dear Sir," like he's writing to a friend. I also found it really interesting. This edition has lots of like interesting prelims and end matter, with lots of like historical context. And Michael Fisher, the editor, writes about how Dean Mahomet was trying to like deconstruct and fight against and reject like the kinds of prejudices and assumptions and misconceptions that were found in other 18th century books about India. So I just found that all really interesting, and I'm glad that I read this at the same time as listening to the Anarchy as well, because I think that kind of helped give extra context. There was definitely still a lot of context that I was missing, but I still found this a really interesting read. But I am sad that I didn't manage to read any fiction from Jane Austen's time, but there we go. Of course, for Jane Austen July, there are also some watching challenges. I did okay on the watching challenges, but again, I think I planned to watch a lot more things than I did. So for the challenge to watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, I rewatched the 2005 Pride and Prejudice film, which I really, really loved. And I watched this with Nick, and he really, really enjoyed it too. So that was really good fun. And then for the challenge to watch a modern screen adaptation or retelling of a Jane Austen book, I watched some of the Lizzie Bennet diaries, but not all of it. I didn't get that far, but I did really enjoy watching what I watched. Otherwise, that is what I have been reading in July. I have also been listening to my own novel, The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hearst, on audiobook, which is something I like to do when I have a book out, because listening to it on audiobook is just like a really nice way to remind myself that I do like this book that I wrote. So that's been really nice too, but I'm still reading that and I will finish that off in August. So there we go. Those are the books that I read in July. Do let me know down in the comments, did you take part in Jane Austen July? What did you read? And that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.